Now I'm going to talk briefly about a couple of the bright spots of the 1990s where mainstream comics, superhero comics if you will, are concerned. I'm going to start with this one, even though chronologically it comes after the other two I'm going to mention, just because it is so closely connected to what we just talked about, the whole Onslaught, Heroes Reborn, Heroes Return thing. So, in 1997, this new comic was introduced by Marvel, Thunderbolts, Justice Like Lightning. And it was a group of all new superheroes who were stepping in to fill the void left by the disappearance and presumed death of the Avengers and the Fantastic Four. And it is eventually revealed that this new group of superheroes are actually Baron Zemo and the Masters of Evil, arch enemies of the Avengers, and it's all a scam. So that's a big reveal. A bunch of people were caught by surprise on that one, both within the comics universe and among the readers. That was a clever idea, but what made it even more not just clever, but what made it even more effective was that over the course of the first year of this book, before the Avengers and Fantastic Four return from that pocket universe, over that time, some of the villains pretending to be heroes discover that they prefer being heroes, and they start to actually, like helping people and stuff. And so that's set up for a big conflict between the leader, Baron Zemo, and those loyal to him, and some of the ones who have developed a conscience at the end. So that was a really, really interesting and different kind of storyline. And it led from there, because you can't just keep that thing going, right? Once it's all been revealed and you've had the final confrontation, how do you continue having a story? Essentially, after that, Thunderbolts becomes kind of like Marvel's version of Suicide Squad, which it is initially then reformed supervillains who are trying to make a new start. But then over time, as this group is co-opted by the U.S. government, they start putting supervillains in it that don't necessarily want to be there, just as an alternative to prison. And they're not very nice people. And eventually the group is assigned leaders who are superheroes that at one point were criminals. So Hawkeye leads it for a long time, and then Luke Cage is the leader of it. And then kind of over time it sort of lost its focus and became just another superhero book. But it started off as a very, very interesting concept. The other couple of things I want to talk about were both illustrated by Alex Ross, who painted every panel. So it's beautifully rendered. The first one from Marvel was called Marvels, and it was a miniseries, later collected into a single bound collection that basically has this new character that is sort of an older guy who's a reporter, who started off as a reporter like 50 years before this, during World War II, and it's his recollections of covering all these major events, from Captain America and the Submariner during World War II to the arrival of the Fantastic Four and various other events. And it's painted, like I said, beautifully, but also in this very, very realistic style. So it gives you a feel of what all these things would look like to an average person on the ground if they had really happened, right, on a realistic Earth. The next one is from DC, a couple of years after that one. This is 1996. It also beautifully painted by Alex Ross. but very, very different, completely different in theme and tone from Marvel's. It is, in fact, not part of DC continuity. It's one of those Elseworlds stories. You know, the things that DC was doing from time to time that were kind of imaginary stories, which is kind of a weird thing, isn't it? Because all these are imaginary stories. Anyway, this one is set about 20 years or so in the future, and in this particular future, the superheroes that we are familiar with, the old guard, have kind of become really out of touch. They're really old-fashioned, and the new generation of superheroes are really hardcore. They're really dark and gritty, amoral, arrogant, and in many ways more frightening and more dangerous than the villains. And this is all set up for a big confrontation, an intergenerational confrontation. So it was well written and beautifully illustrated. All right, now we are about to enter what I have decided to call the Pearl Age. We'll see if I can get that to stick. So, essentially, the Foil Age, also my creation, started in 1990 with the publication of Spider-Man #1 by Todd McFarlane and the beginning of the just absolutely mad, headlong rush of people to try to invest in comic books, and then all the die-cut hologram covers and all the gimmicks and all that stuff that led to this bubble, which then burst in 1994 and went into a sort of almost death spiral for comic books that culminated in the bankruptcy of Marvel Comics in 1996, and in 96 and 97 to the whole Heroes Reborn and Heroes Return thing at Marvel, which was sort of like, well, it was the culmination. In some ways, the Kingdom Come, which was a very well done thing over at DC, also kind of was setting the stage for the next incarnation of DC. Although Alex Ross's paintings, one could, I suppose, describe that also as a gimmick, because it was something very, very different. But my gosh, it was beautiful. It was well done. All right, well, Pearl Age, I decided to call it that because I gave it quite a bit of thought. I was trying to think of something that would apply to a time of transition that comes out of something very negative and slowly turns into something positive. And so that's why I ultimately hit on the idea of Pearl, because, if you don't know how a pearl is formed in an oyster, it starts with a grain of sand, and then the oyster getting inside, and then the oyster secretes this stuff to cover over that grain of sand, so as to remove the source of irritation, and then over time that builds up and builds up until you have a beautiful pearl. All right, well, in the context of mainstream comic books, and really of graphic novels and sequential art in general, this time period, beginning with that big collapse in the late 90s, would be a time of transition that would be transitional throughout the first decade of the 21st century. So it is going to be a time after the collapse of the bubble when Marvel and DC in particular, and to a lesser extent some of the smaller companies, are trying not only to rebuild their business, but to rebuild their brand and to establish their new approach, to establish their identity moving forward. And both Marvel and DC in the first decade of the 21st century are going to be doing some really drastic things story-wise to try to establish their company and their brand's identity. Now, this is also a time period from the late 90s until roughly 2010 when there's going to be a transition in how graphic art is consumed by customers. Very, very kind of gradually. Well, maybe not gradually. Around the turn of the century, around 2000, there just seemed to be this flowering renaissance of graphic novels. Graphic novels, by which I mean not necessarily just those things like Watchmen from 1986 and Dark Knight Returns from that year, in which you've got a comic book miniseries that then gets collected into one volume and called a graphic novel. So I'm talking about that, but even more so, I'm talking about all new, all original, self-contained stories, novels, really, that are just all of a sudden the quality of those things and the amount of them just start to proliferate in the late 90s, early 2000s, and start to get more critical attention to the extent that it's not like Watchmen or Mouse, where it gets critical attention and everyone thinks that's weird because it's comic books. But now it's just a normally accepted thing that graphic novels are art and that they are literature. And at the same time, the sale of those other kinds of graphic novels, which are reprinted collections of things that had originally appeared in serial comic books, that's serial with an S, that also takes off over the course of that decade or so, to the extent that comic book publishers, particularly of any title that seems to have any sales promise whatsoever, unless it's something brand new that they're not sure about, it kind of begins to be structured. The stories in the comic books themselves start to be structured in 6, 7, or 8 chapter stories. It's very rare now to pick up a comic book and have one single self-contained story that has a beginning and a definite end, and then next month, you got the same character doing something completely different. Now there are story arcs that last for several issues with an eye toward reprinting those things in graphic novel format. So the graphic novel format is not an afterthought now. It is a forethought and the ultimate goal of the publishers. So that becomes different. So comic book stories by 2010 were not even being read, even when they're being read, not by most people in comic book form, even if they first come out in comic book form. Whether they do or not, they're being read in, trade paperback size graphic art collections that might be sold at a comics shop, but even more copies will be sold at regular bookstores. So any major chain bookstore, if you can find a major chain bookstore anymore, that you go into, will have a graphic novel section that is as big as any of the other sections in the store. So that's a change. Another shift that is going to shift the company's identity and the character's identity is the move toward establishing their characters on screen, on television and movies. Now that's not new, right? There was Superman serials with an S again. In the early 40s, there was a long-running Superman TV show in the 50s, Batman in the 60s. There was the campy Batman movie in the 60s. There was the big-budget, successful Superman movie of the 70s. But the difference between those things and the more recent comic book character movies is that, if Superman the motion picture, let's say, came out 1978 and you went to see that, or Batman with Michael Keaton in 1989, people see that and are like, I'm very, very familiar with this property. I am seeing now on the screen things that in my childhood I read in a comic book. That's not how most audiences react now. If there is a new Batman movie or a Wonder Woman movie or Captain America or whatever, the largest number of the audience, especially if they're under, let's say, if they're under 35 or 40 years old, they didn't necessarily grow up reading this stuff. In fact, they are much more likely to be familiar with the versions of those characters that appear on the screen, even when the screen versions are dramatically different from what has appeared in the comic books. Well, also, graphic novels have become not only accepted critically, but they've started to become fairly commonplace in education. There are graphic novels assigned sometimes in high school and college classes. Now, of course, I assign graphic novels in the history of comic books class, but here's just some examples of graphic novels that I regularly assign in just my normal basic U.S. history classes. All three of those examples, by the way, published in the 21st century, not the 20th century. If you were to have a discussion about graphic novels separate from comic books, and you were to pick out several representative ones that are very high quality, you would have a handful of classics like perhaps Watchmen and definitely Mouse. But most of what you would have to choose from would be from the last 20 years or so, late 90s on. In fact, I know of courses that are taught that are critical studies of graphic novels, in which virtually everything discussed is from the year 2000 or more recently. So there's been that creative flowering, but that has been accommodated by the fact that more and more bookstores, like I said, are selling a lot of graphic novels. And really, the graphic novel format, whether you're talking about an original self-contained actual novel or reprints from comic book stories or superhero stories, for publishers, doing it in that mass market paperback format and selling them through regular bookstores is a lot more secure. It's a lot less of a gamble. It's a lot more consistent of a business model and more consistent of a profit expectation, because comic books kind of fluctuate, right? So all those things together have led to this renaissance, really, a renaissance of graphic art in the last 20-25 years, which continues to be, well, it continues to grow, and it continues to become more commonplace, even as comic books themselves are becoming really less commonplace. And another big difference between people who do even read the comic books now and people who read the comics, let's say 30 years ago, is that the people who read the comics now, more often than not, younger folks, college age, didn't grow up reading them from the time they first started to read. It wasn't something that all their friends did, which was the case for decades and decades. And increasingly, when I meet college students who have read comic books or graphic novels, it's often their dad or their mom's old collection of comic books that that parent has shared with them as kind of a bonding experience. Not something that, like in my time, just naturally happens because all the kids even in first grade, are buying comic books. So, really, if I could lay out and go into detail about all the quality graphic novels that have been published in the last 20 years, well, like I said, there's an entire semester-long course at Tennessee Tech that does that. So suffice it to say that turn of the century, the beginning of the 21st century, saw kind of a renaissance and a flowering of the graphic novel. Well, let's take a look now at mainstream comics during this period and their efforts to reestablish an identity or refine an identity. But first, before we look at the big two, Marvel and DC, let's just take a look at the different companies that are out there right now as of 2020, the top 10 profitable, top 10 highest shares of the market. So you've got Marvel and DC, followed by Dark Horse and Image, IDW, which was established in 1999. You've still got Archie Comics, Boom Comics, and Dynamite Comics, both of which were in the mid-2000 decade. And Valiant, you'll notice there's two dates there. Valiant was established in 1991, actually founded by Jim Shooter, and they went out of business in the mid-90s and have reestablished themselves with their original characters in 2011. And finally, Oni Press. All right, well, I tell you what, this is a warning. This stuff is going to get kind of convoluted because one of the earmarks of DC in particular trying to establish or reestablish or refine or define its identity is a bunch of retcons, a bunch of remember a Crisis on Infinite Earths? That was something to clean up the previous 20 years of continuity. Well, in the 2000s, DC started doing that every couple of years, basically, and it gets very confusing. We'll start actually a little bit earlier than the Pearl Age, with 1994 and a big crossover event from DC, 0 Hour. Now, we didn't talk about it before, yet we're talking about it now, because it kind of sets the stage for what's going to happen in the 2000s. 0 Hour was the first time after Crisis on Infinite Earths that DC sort of messed around with the timeline. The first, but not the last. Well, it was enough. It was enough to do them for about a decade, but a decade later they started doing it sort of habitually. The storyline here of 0 Hour is kind of in the aftermath of the death of Superman and the return of Superman. Over the course of that story, a big bad guy destroyed Hal Jordan, alias the Green Lantern's hometown of Coast City, and Hal Jordan kind of went nuts and became himself a big bad guy because he was going to try to remake the entire universe to make it better. Initially to bring back his hometown, but then just to improve everything. And of course, the other good guys couldn't stand for that. So there was a big fight, and at the end, that's when the new Green Lantern, Kyle Rayner, was introduced. A couple of years after this, Hal Jordan heroically sacrificed himself to try to undo the things he had done. And then a couple of years after that, he became the Spectre, and then eventually came back as Green Lantern. But the reason we're talking about this now is that as he's trying to mess with reality, then reality got revised again, just like it had in 1985-86 Crisis miniseries. Not nearly on as big a scale. There were some minor changes that came out of this, and it was an opportunity for DC to make some adjustments. Now, in 0 hour number 0 in the back, they had a timeline, a new timeline that you could use to figure out what the heck is going on. So, as you can see here, the time periods from the past sometimes have specific dates attached to them, like, World War I, 1938 being the beginning of the golden age of heroes, though you'll notice no Superman, no Batman, no Wonder Woman, because now, there's not the Earth 1, Earth 2. But when it gets closer to the modern era, all of a sudden you don't get dates, you get how many years ago something happened. So no matter what year you're reading a DC comic, it could be 1994, it could be 2002, roughly 10 years ago, Superman became a superhero. Another change, well, the one of the big changes was that in this new revised timeline, Wonder Woman didn't show up until after the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, on this new reality of Earth. So she was not one of the founding members of the Justice League. She wasn't there in their early adventures. All that's gone. And she just kind of showed up afterward. So for a few years, DC kind of stuck with this timeline. Then in 2004, there was a 7-part miniseries. Now, this wasn't a huge company-wide crossover. There were a couple of comics this tied into, but it was kind of a standalone thing. But it was also a prequel to what was yet to come. So, in Identity Crisis, which, by the way, had kind of a mixed reception. Some people read this and thought, oh my gosh, this is very, very powerfully written. This is such a powerful story. Other people read it and thought, this doesn't seem like the kind of thing that DC Comics should be really doing. And you'll see what I mean in a moment. So the story opens up with the wife of the elongated man. That's the elongated man there in the lower right-hand corner with his wife. He's the stretchy guy. He's basically Plastic Man with a less surreal sense of humor. So anyway, his wife is murdered. They're trying to figure out who killed her. It looks as though she's been burned. Some people think, hey, this looks like the work of our archenemy, Dr. Light. And over the course of this miniseries, as the Flash, and the Flash is Wally West, formerly the Kid Flash, although at this point, right, it's been almost 19 years in real time since he had taken over. He's trying to solve this mystery, and there's stuff that other people seem to know that he doesn't know because they've been in the Justice League longer than he has, right? Because it was his predecessor, Barry Allen, that was the co-founder of the Justice League. So here's what he finds out eventually. Years ago, Dr. Light snuck into the headquarters of the Justice League years ago, and before Barry Allen died, when he was the original Flash, long before Wally West was a member of the Justice League, that Dr. Light had found his way into the Justice League headquarters. I think maybe they had captured him and he got loose. And the elongated man, alias Ralph Dibny, his wife Sue, who frequently hung out there, was there alone, and Dr. Light brutally raped her. Then, the other superheroes got home and they caught him, and everybody's really angry. And there's a member of the League we haven't really talked about that much, but she's been around since the 60s, Zatanna, who is she's kind of like DC's female version of Doctor Strange. She is a sorcerer. And so it was decided that in order to prevent Dr. Light to punish him and keep him from doing this sort of thing again, especially since he now knew where their headquarters and stuff was, that they were going to wipe his memory of all those things. And while they were at it, to change his personality and make him into kind of a simpleton, really. Make him into a mentally challenged person. Take away his intellect completely, so he would no longer be a danger to anyone else. Now, there were some misgivings about this, and everybody wasn't there when it happened. But then it happened again. Not Dr. Light, but a bunch of other supervillains managed to switch places with the superheroes. That is, to switch their minds and get into the superheroes' minds, and therefore discovered all their secret identities. Well, now, this is a big danger, because with this happening, the loved ones of all the Justice League members could be exposed and in danger to be hurt in retaliation for the Justice League, fighting crime and so forth. So it was decided again by the people who were involved. Barry Allen was one of them. He was reluctant, but they talked him into it. That it was decided to wipe the memories of all those bad guys that they had caught. And it was done, but Batman had he didn't have reservations. He was adamantly opposed to doing this because he believed it was immoral and betrayed their principles and was a slippery slope. They already started down that slippery slope, and it had gotten now more slipperier. So all that happened. Wally West finds out about it, and eventually, over the course of this, as Wally West is investigating, turns out Batman has no idea what he's talking about. So, being the world's greatest detective, Batman quickly figures out they'd wiped his mind too. Taken all that out of his memory to keep him from interfering. So, Batman's got kind of a persecution complex to begin with, right? He's a little paranoid. Well, maybe you're not paranoid if it turns out they are really after you, and while they're at it, they wiped your memory. So, this makes Batman, puts him in a bad mood, and makes him determined to keep a close eye on his colleagues, because he feels like they really can't be trusted. And all that is setting up the next big crossover event. Now, this is an interesting story because it presents a moral dilemma. And that is, that's one of the earmarks of a really good story. That's what made really Stan Lee's stories in the 60s stand out from DC stories. Where the hero was the hero, the bad guy was the bad guy, end of story. You've got a moral dilemma, an ethical dilemma, then you've got conflict, and then you've got the makings of a story. So that's good, and it's an interesting question to be raised. How far is too far? And there's kind of a double layer of meaning there with identity crisis, because someone has been messing with your mind How do you know that you even really are who you think you are? And on another level, this is an identity crisis for the Justice League of America and the superheroes who belong to it, because what is a hero? What are they trying to be? What do they want to be? And is it possible to cross a line and to have, compromised your very identity? Now, all that is all that is true. That those are elements that make for a complex story and an interesting story. Did they really have to brutally rape yet another woman? This is like this is 5 years after Gail Simone had written her famous essay about women in refrigerators and put together her website. And by this time, Gail Simone was working for DC Comics as a writer on their some of their other titles. So didn't anybody at any point think maybe the fact that we're doing this is a lot worse than Carol Danvers alias Miss Marvel, because it is brutal and violent. Not that there's not that we're trying to get morally relativistic. When I say it's a lot worse, I mean that they showed the brutality and the violence. It was, it wasn't like X-rated explicit, but it was very deeply disturbing. Is that what you want to be doing in a story about, Superman and Wonder Woman? In fact, is that crossing a line and going down a slippery slope? Not just, and I'm not just talking about, I'm not talking about Victorian puritanical morals. I'm talking about that level of misogyny when, as we've been discussing off and on, the whole superhero concept generally from the beginning was a male power fantasy. And what is more of a male power fantasy than this type of story? It's the bad guy doing this stuff, but again, is it not just a slippery slope? Is it a straight slide into a place you just don't want to go, and that you don't want to take your readers along with you? By the way, as sort of a PS to this, and spoiler alert, turns out that Sue Dibney, who had been brutally raped by Dr. Light years ago, now it was her murder in the present that started this investigation, right? Turns out she was not murdered by any supervillain. She was murdered by the Atom's ex-wife, who's trying to get back with him, and was basically trying to create an emergency to get her ex-husband to come running back to her, and it got out of hand, and oops, she killed her. Now, that doesn't help either, does it? You've got this very misogynistic storyline. Turns out the villain is a crazy lady who's trying to get back with her boyfriend by killing somebody. I think that the same story could have been told, but it could have been told differently.